Well, it's great to welcome you back as we are continuing our studies of the Greek that is found in the New Testament. We are coming at this point to lesson number 3. I hope you have your textbook. If you don't have a textbook, then I'd strongly recommend that you get the textbook first before proceeding to this lesson. And actually, even the last lesson we looked at, chapter 2, really required the textbook. The textbook is J. Gresham Machen's New Testament Greek for Beginners. It's still readily available. You can get it from online booksellers, and otherwise you might be able to pick up a copy. It has certainly stood the test of time and continues to be a standard work in introducing the Greek language. We are coming to chapter 3 at this point, and you'll be happy to know that chapter 3 is actually a little easier than chapter 2. Chapter 2 usually is a bit daunting to New Testament Greek students when they're having to confront the rules of accent, not having really had an opportunity to do much with the Greek language itself, so it can be somewhat challenging to dive right in. But hopefully as we go along, those rules of accent will become increasingly natural to you. As I indicated to you before, I really do suggest that you spend the time necessary to really get a feel for those rules of accent. You'll find that it does make your study of the Greek language make a little bit more sense. This lesson brings us really to the first vocabulary words that we're going to be dealing with. These are all verbs, and they are very, very common verbs that are found frequently in the New Testament. The verbs are, I'll go through these, of course, much more slowly as we go along, but blepo, gnosko, grapho, didasko, lambano, lego, luo, echo. You notice that each of those words ends with the sound O, and that is right off the bat a little hint as to something about the Greek language, and that is that it is an inflected language. What that means is that you can formulate the first person, second person, third person, singular and plural strictly based off the ending to the verb. Now, in English, of course, we do that somewhat differently. We would say, I see, you see, he sees, we see, you plural see, and they see. And you notice the word see in all of those situations doesn't change except for the third person singular where it becomes sees. So if you simply saw that word, S-E-E, in English, you wouldn't be able to tell whether you're referring to the first, second, third person, singular, plural. All of that is more or less ambiguous. So in the English language, we rely on the presence of the pronoun I, you, he, and so on to tell us who exactly is envisioned in that verb. Greek and other inflected languages, this would include French, Italian, Latin, and so on, all use the ending in order to communicate what is the person and number that's involved. So for example, if I want to say I see in Greek, I would say blepo. If I wanted to say he sees in Greek, I would say blepe. And so the reason that you see that ending O in each case is because it's saying this is the first person singular form of the verb. In the vocabulary, that's the form that you're going to be presented. You might have expected it would be the infinitive, to see, but in Greek it's more common to introduce it with the first person singular, and that's the convention that is used by Machen, and of course that's the convention that we will follow as well. So just that little introduction to the topic at hand, and we're going to proceed by looking at the vocabulary words. We'll look at the ways in which we can formulate the conjugation of the verb, and then we'll do a couple of exercises, and I'll leave it to you to finish up the exercises on your own. And once you've done so, you can take a look at the answer key, which I've provided, and compare your work to what you find in the answer key. And if all goes well, and you feel like you've got a mastery of this chapter, then we'll proceed to chapter 4. And in the meantime, let's go ahead and take a look at this chapter now. So we're looking here at the first page of chapter 3. And you'll notice the vocabulary list is provided for you. The first of the words that we have here is, can you say that? Blepo, blepo. You may know the English word, it's an eye disease, blepharitis, which actually is taken from this Greek root, but it means I see. As we were indicating a moment ago, it's the first person singular. A little later we're going to see how to formulate the second and third person singular and plural, but for now you just want to remember that word, beta, lambda, epsilon, pi, omega, blepo is the word, means I see. The second word that we have here is the word gnosko, gnosko. Again, this is the first person singular, I know. You'll notice in English we have the K there, which is silent, no, but actually it's related to this English word gnosko. I suppose if we were a little more accurate, we might say I know, you know, the kappa becoming the English form of the gamma, but it actually is a related word, gnosko. I know. In the New Testament, this is the word that usually means to know in the sense of a personal acquaintance. There's a different word which would normally be used to communicate the idea of knowing factual data. But if I wanted to say, I know you in the sense that I'm acquainted with you, then this is the word that would be used. And I might mention the euphemism in the New Testament for a sexual relation, a man knows his wife, it always is this word as well. So it does some fairly important duty in the New Testament. The next word we have here is the word grapho. Grapho means I write. You're familiar, of course, with all kinds of English words that use the word graph, telegraph, phonograph, that sort of thing, graphics. All of these have to do with some form of writing, and they're all taken from this Greek root, the word for write, I write, grapho. Here we have the word didasko, didasko. Maybe you know the word didactic. Didactic means in some sense or other to be teaching. Hopefully I'm being somewhat didactic right now as I'm attempting to teach you. It all is derived from this Greek word didasko, means I teach. Here we have the word lambano, lambano. It means I take. It can also mean I receive, so you might want to make a little note of that. I'm not aware of any English cognates to this, so you'll just have to learn this one, but lambano is quite common in the New Testament. I take or I receive. Here we have the word lego, lego, I say. The third person plural for lego is going to be legusi. We're going to look at that, of course, separately, but I'm mentioning it now because you may be familiar with the English word legacy. A legacy is usually associated with the reputation that somebody leaves behind, but the literal idea of it is what do they say about that person. The third person plural of lego is legacy, and that is directly where we get that English expression legacy. Literally would be the they say of a person, the reputation they leave behind. Luo means I loose. It can also mean I destroy. The word luo is actually the root behind the word loose. To loose in the sense of to loose somebody, to free a slave, that would be the idea. And finally we have the word echo, echo. The chi there should be kind of pronounced with a guttural sound, echo, if you want to be a little bit more precise, but I'm afraid I'm too much a victim of my own English language, so I'm going to simply use the convention echo. Echo, I have. Notice Machen points out here in paragraph 17 that the Greek verb has tense, voice, and mood. Now, if you know something about grammar, then you probably know the meaning of all of those words. We're going to look at them in more detail later, but it's worth noting that right now we're dealing with the present tense, the active voice, and the indicative mood. Tense has to do with when an action takes place. Voice has to do with how it takes place, that is to say, is it active, that is the subject of the sentence acting, or is it passive, is the subject of the sentence being acted upon. And Greek also has, by the way, a middle voice that we'll talk about a little bit later. And then finally the mood, which is actually a description of how this particular statement relates to reality. The indicative mood is simply indicating things that are happening, as it were, in the real world, and for now that's where we're going to leave it. So he explains that for us in this section. Now, we indicated to you that with an inflected language, you're going to determine the person and the number based on the ending. So we noticed here we have luo, which means I loose. It can also mean I am loosing. In Greek, there is no sharp distinction between the simple punctiliar idea, I loose, and the ongoing linear idea, I am loosing. That's not true of every tense in Greek, but it is true of the present tense. So you just have to determine from the context which seems to be the more meaningful, which makes the more sense. The second person singular, lues, thou loosest, or thou art loosing. If you read the chapter, you may note that Machen uses this convention, a kind of Old English pronoun here, thou, because it does distinguish from the plural ye. And because Greek does make that distinction between the singular and the plural, it's helpful to have an English convention by which we can make the same distinction. And so he uses the convention of thou for the singular and ye for the plural. So if you find that helpful, that's fine. You'll find that I do use it as we go along, just on occasion, because it does really help us to make that distinction. So make a note of that. Lue is the third person singular. He looses, or he is loosing. Luomen over here, the first person plural. We loose. Luete, the second person plural. You loose. And luusi, the third person plural. They loose. Machen points out it'll be observed that the distinction between the first person, the second person, and the third person, and between the singular and plural numbers, which in English are indicated by subject pronouns like he or it or she or they, are indicated in Greek by the endings. I've already mentioned that to you in our introduction to this chapter, so you just want to make a note of that and make sure you understand that idea. Machen explains here in paragraph 20 that the part of the verb that remains constant is called the stem. The present stem, for example, of luo is the word lu. And then to that stem, you're going to add the various endings, which we've noticed here, the endings o, ace, a, omen, eta, usi. You may be interested in noting here that these are the primary personal endings, and he indicates that they belong to the primary tenses. We're going to say a little bit more about those as we go along. Don't worry about it right now, but if you're a history aficionado, you may be interested in knowing that the original endings probably look like this. This goes way back to Attic Greek, and so it's a little bit of the history of the Greek language, but really, in terms of our immediate concern, we're not going to be bothering too much with those endings. It's simply there to point out the history out of which these koine endings were formulated. He notes here at paragraph 21 what I was mentioning earlier, that there's no distinction between I loose and I am loosing. The first of those is sometimes called punctiliar, meaning it takes place in a point in time. The other is sometimes called linear, meaning it takes place over a continuing conception of time. So I loose, punctiliar, as opposed to I am loosing, which is the linear idea. He continues that discussion here. The second person, you loose or you are loosing, in an English may be formed either in the second, in the singular or the plural, and he mentions here that he's going to use this convention thou and ye in order to make that distinction. All right, well, that brings us now to the exercises. What I'm going to do as a rule throughout these studies is give you the first 2 or 3 and then leave it to you to go ahead and work out the rest. I've provided to you an answer key, and so you can do the exercises, and indeed I insist that you do them. Otherwise I'm going to show up on your doorstep and give you a bad time, but you need to do all the exercises. I think the best way to do it is to do an exercise and then immediately look at the answer key to see whether you've done it correctly. If so, move on. If not, try to figure out where the problem is. Like I say, I'm going to do the first few in our online presentations, and then I'll leave it to you to proceed from there. So he starts off here asking you to simply translate the words that you have before us. So all English exercises, he says, should be written. For purposes of this course, I'm going to let you type them. You have the Greek font for doing that. But let's just do the first two or three. So here we have the word blepes, and I notice immediately that it has the ending for the second person singular, and if I use the convention of thou that he gives us there, then I would translate that thou seest, or you see if you prefer to use that form. Similarly, I have the word genoske, same ending on the word genosko, so you, singular, or thou knowest. And then finally, we have the word lambane, same ending, and the stem means to take or receive, so we would translate that you, singular, take, or you receive. The second set, of course, we have now the third person singular, so we would translate this he writes. It could also be she writes, although if it were she writes, typically the context would include, in that case, a pronoun to make it clear that we're talking about a feminine actor rather than a masculine one. The default, of course, is masculine. Secondly, we have here he has, echo, he has. And thirdly, we have he says. So those should be pretty straightforward. Now we come down here, lue, he looses, didaske, he teaches, and finally blepe, he sees. So you can see it's pretty straightforward. You look at the ending to determine what is the person and number of the verb, and then you simply look at the verb, and whatever the meaning is, you use to generate the particular form that we're dealing with. All right, let's look at the other set of exercises. These are composition. And again, I'm just going to take a look at the first one. I won't put down the English here because it's obvious enough, but you'll notice the first one says, we are knowing. And so if I'm going to translate that, we are knowing, I know that the word for know is gnosko, so I'm going to start with that. Gnos, sigma. And now it's we, which is the first person plural, so we'll translate it this way. Gnoskomen. It means we know. I know that the accent here is going to stand on the antepenult, and the reason for that is because it's a three-syllable word. I know that the accent wants to go as far back into the word as it can. I notice that that is short, and so when I go back as far as I can, I arrive at the antepenult, and I know that only an acute can stand on the antepenult, so I know my accenting there is going to be correct, and that would be the first of the exercises. The next one, let's actually skip to number 2, and it says they are loosing, so let's put this one up here. They are loosing. The root, I know, is loo, and the third person plural is usi, so I'm going to go omicron, upsilon, sigma, iota. And again, the rules of accent are going to function about the same way. So as I look at this word, I notice that it's a three-syllable word. In these verbs, the final iota is always short, and I can just make a little note of that, so I know that if the accent goes back as far as it can, it's going to go to the antepenult, and we wind up then with the acute accent on the antepenult as we see it there. The last of the exercises that we'll illustrate here, let's go to number 3, and it says he is loosing, so we have the same word. Stem, it's loo, and then the he is loosing, so I know that ending is loo-a. Again, I might ask myself, what am I going to do with the accent here? But I have an answer that is readily enough available. I notice that this is a diphthong. Diphthongs are always long, except for two exceptions, alpha iota and omicron iota, and only when they are the last two letters of a word. I notice that epsilon iota is not either of those, so it must be long, because otherwise diphthongs are always long. I know when last is long, acute on the penult. I know that the accent will be on the penult because of the recessive rule, and so I know for sure that the acute accent goes on the word lue here, and that's the way the accenting is going to be performed. All right, so there you've got 3 of the exercises. I'm going to leave the rest of the exercises to you, and I hopefully will be able to congratulate you as you come back to the next lesson and take a look at these and see how you've done. So that will complete our studies of the 3rd chapter of Machen. We've learned the vocabulary words, blepo-gnosko, grapho-didasko, lambano, lego, luo, echo. Those are words that you want to commit to memory. They're very common in the New Testament. And you'll find that if you can master these vocabulary words as you go along, it'll make your labors later much, much easier. You also want to learn these endings and be able to, more or less with some facility, be able to attach the ending to the verb. So if I want to say I take, it's lambano. If I want to say you plural take, it's lambanate, you see, and you can just put those together rather easily. And that will again form a good foundation for your future studies. So go ahead and do the exercises. I've provided to you the answer key, which you can pop up on screen or download. And make sure that you understand all of the ins and outs of these exercises. When you're ready to do so, then proceed to lesson 4, and we'll see you at that time.